Hey, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Sacred Masculinity podcast. So lately there's been this meme going around where if a woman was out in nature and she had to choose between a man or a bear, which would she choose? And evidently, most of the time, women have chosen the bear. So this meme that's come out. It's an interesting one because it's fundamentally gotten people to explore, well, why would, or ask the question, like, well, why would someone choose the bear versus the man, right? And the thing is that there's very good reasons for it, but I think a lot of men are having interesting reactions to it. And so, you have a woman, she's in the forest, and down one path is the bear, and down the other path is a man. Which would she choose? And the woman will choose the bear. And the reason that they're choosing the bear most of the time is because they're like, well, I know what to expect with the bear. I know that the bear is dangerous. I know that the bear could kill me, everything else. But I don't know the same thing with a man. I don't know what to expect with a man. And I think fundamentally that this meme is a great example of how men are being given an opportunity to look at their own privilege and their own sense of entitlement around relationships, around sex, around other things. And I also think at the same time that it illustrates that there is a lot of change going on right now. And a lot of men feel really lost because they don't know how to deal with that change. And when I first found out about this meme, I thought about it and I thought it was really interesting, and I reflected on it in relationship to my own experiences. And what I really came away with was a fundamental understanding that for a long time, men have acted like they can do no wrong. And they a lot of times they've been enculturated to believe that it's perfectly okay, for example, to hit on any woman, or to be, to be overtly sexual without any real sense of things. And it's interesting because sometimes I'll go on different dating apps like Bumble or Tinder or Facebook dating, and on these apps, what I end up seeing a lot of the time is in women's profiles is like, if you're here just to hook up, or if you're here looking for sex, just swipe to the left. I want a man who is sensitive, who is aware, who's, in some cases, someone will say, I want a man who's going to take the lead, who's going to take charge, and I'm not going to pass judgment on any of that per se, because I think that those are all equally valid requests. And, some women want men of a certain type. In one sense, they want them to be a certain way, and some women want men in a different way, and that's okay. But I think that as I look at these things, and I look at the bear and the forest meme, what really stands out to me is that men fundamentally are being called upon to change. And I think a lot of men haven't caught up to that yet. And it's not too surprising because we have a very patriarchal society still in a lot of ways. And we see that with the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade. I mean, that's a prime example of a patriarchal society at work. I think it's really important to acknowledge and understand that, there's these kinds of forces at play, and that we need to look at that. But more than that, I also think that this is a fundamental call for men to reorient around their relationships with women. And I mean, I'll admit I'm primarily speaking here to basically a heterosexual audience here of cisgender men more often than not. But there may be some bisexual men as well. But I think that even some of this could possibly apply, outside of that, even to queer gay circumstances, circles. But I want to be clear that the reason I'm really speaking to this is because the meme is, a woman's out in the forest. She sees a man and she sees a bear. Which one is she going to choose? She's going to choose the bear. Okay, well, why is that? That's really fundamentally the question here. For myself, when I've thought about this meme, I've looked at my own entitlement. How many times have I felt like I've been entitled, or had some sense of privilege around like sex, for example? Oh, I'm entitled, you know, I'm entitled to expect that something will happen sexually. I'm not saying that I've always had that expectation, but I think that that is an expectation that I can point to at times and say, yeah, it's been there. And honestly, it's uncomfortable to admit that, because there's also a sense of shame there, like, oh, I feel this way. I mean, it's a perfectly natural need and a desire. And yet at the same time, it has become such a charge point in a lot of ways. And for good reason. I mean, when we look at how men behave when it comes to sex, locker room talk, forcing themselves on somebody, rape, just to name a few things, we can understand why that is. And it's interesting because I've even in the course of doing all the men's work that I've done, I've taken a few different courses. I've read some different books, and some of that has been, like some stuff along the lines of what I would call the shadow side of the men's movement, where like people who are like pickup artists and stuff. And it's interesting to see how they approach this same topic and how they act a certain way. And it speaks to kind of the entitlement and the privilege again, that I don't think is really necessarily always healthy. And I honestly think that in general, men are at a loss when it comes to relationships in some ways, because it's like, well, suddenly I'm expected to be a lot more emotionally vulnerable, present, and aware, and suddenly I'm also discovering that there are that certain expectations I have, really need to be re-examined and retooled and looked at carefully, and I need to be operating from a place of consent. And these are things that I've taken for granted in the past. And it's good that we're being forced to look at this. It's good that men are really having to take a hard look at this within themselves and in relationship to the women around them. But it's also important for men to acknowledge, like, look, these are all the ways you've been given like a free pass maybe up until now, and it's time for you to really examine these assumptions, these values that you have, these ideas around what it means to be a man, all these other things that are easily taken for granted. And also to really ask, well, if a woman is choosing the bear because she knows what to expect with the bear, but she doesn't know what to expect with the man, doesn't that really ultimately imply that in a way that the bear, even though the bear is dangerous, is actually ironically enough safer because they know the bear is dangerous, whereas with the man, they don't know what's going to happen with the man. And you might say, but I'm not that guy. I'm a good guy. I'm a nice guy, etc. And I'd say, well, that's great. And really check yourself and look at your own privilege. Check yourself and look at the assumptions that you're making. Check yourself and really look at how you're choosing to show up. What are the expectations you have? All of these things are really important to look at, and a lot of times they aren't looked at because we'd rather bury our heads in the sand. I mean, ultimately, what I'm really thinking about of late is that fundamentally men need to change their relationship with themselves. where because a lot of times I think that the other problem, and this is something that men don't really explore, but I think it's important to, is how much men rely upon validation from their partners. I want this person to love me. I want this person to X, Y, and Z. Okay, all those things are important. And how much of that is an assumption right there? How often are we making an assumption about who we are and what we expect? How often are we making an assumption about, the kind of relationships that we're in and what we think we'll get out of those relationships? We need to examine that carefully. We need to recognize that it is fundamentally an assumption that we're making. And it's one that we don't necessarily always want to be making. Men are at a cross point. And it'll be interesting to see what happens as men continue to do the work they need to do on themselves and to change and become better men and better human beings. Maybe someday that bear in the forest meme will have a different answer. But right now, it justifiably has the answer it has. And what men ought to do is really take a good hard look at that and examine and ask themselves, how am I contributing to why that answer is the way it is? That's a good place to start and a good way to get into men's work and really exploring kind of the assumptions that you have around being a man, with yourself, and being a man in relationship to women, and like being a man in a romantic relationship and what all that means. So some thoughts for you to ponder, and I hope you do. And if you need help with that men's work, check out the link below.